It's July 4, 1969, 9:45 p.m. at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. The air is warm, the sun has just set, and the sounds of fireworks crackling in the distance fill the air. People are gathered around a picnic table, the sound of children's laughter and the smell of barbecuing fill the air. A man is approached by a stranger who asks for an ashtray, and in a split second, the unthinkable happens. The sound of a gunshot echoes through the park. The scene unfolds like a horror movie, with people running for cover, screaming, and chaos erupting. The victim, a 29-year-old man, is lying on the ground, clutching his stomach, and a pool of blood is spreading rapidly across the pavement. The smell of gunpowder and smoke wafts through the air, and the sound of sirens is just getting started. The park is in absolute pandemonium, with people trying to make sense of what just happened. The stranger is nowhere to be found, leaving behind a cryptic message scrawled on a nearby phone booth wall. The victim is later identified as David Faraday, a 17-year-old high school student who was on his first date. He's lying on the ground, mortally wounded, and his date is crying uncontrollably as she tries to process what just happened. The killer, still at large, has left behind a calling card, a cryptic note that reads, "This is the Zodiac speaking." The note is signed with a symbol, a signature that will become synonymous with terror and fear. David Faraday's life has been cut short in a moment, leaving behind a family and friends who will never be the same. Witnesses describe seeing a man in a black suit and fedora, around 5 feet 8 inches with a receding hairline, and a distinctive way of walking. Some claim to have seen a car speeding away from the scene, while others heard a strange voice saying, "I'll get you," to one of the witnesses. The park is filled with the sound of sirens as police and paramedics rush to the scene. People are running around, trying to get a glimpse of the killer, and the atmosphere is one of pure chaos and panic. The victim's date is screaming for help, but it may already be too late. The central figure in the Zodiac Killer case was a man known only by his cryptic name, which he often signed into the letters and codes he sent to the press. His true identity remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American true crime history. He claimed to be Robert Newmeyer, but this alias has since been debunked and his true name remains a secret. Born in 1943 or 1944, depending on the source, the Zodiac Killer was in his early to mid-20s when the murders began. He lived in Northern California, primarily in the Bay Area and surrounding regions. He worked as a cab driver and a mechanic, living paycheck to paycheck, and his social life was largely solitary. However, he did have family and acquaintances who described him as friendly, outgoing, and even charismatic. To those around him, he seemed to be a regular guy, just trying to make ends meet. He was reportedly a skilled mechanic and had a certain charm about him that made people trust him. His daily routine was unremarkable, but with a sense of normalcy that would later prove deceiving. The Zodiac Killer's likability and relatability stemmed from his humble demeanor and unassuming nature. He seemed to be just another face in the crowd, not particularly notable in any way. This made it even more shocking when his dark secret was eventually exposed. People who knew him said he was a good listener and had a way of making you feel at ease. He seemed like a guy you could trust, which is precisely what made his crimes so heinous. Despite his friendly exterior, the Zodiac Killer's relationships with those around him are still shrouded in mystery. It's unclear who he trusted or confided in, as he seemed to be a man who isolated himself from others. His motives for committing the crimes are still unknown, and his relationships with his victims and their families remain a dark and twisted aspect of the case. It's possible that he used his charm to lure in his victims, but the extent of his manipulation is still unclear. As we delve deeper into the case, one question remains: what drove him to become one of America's most infamous serial killers? Here are the spoken words for the crime chapter of the Zodiac Killer video. On July 4, 1969, at approximately 9:45 p.m., David Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, were making their way to a secluded lover's lane on Blue Rock Springs Road in Vallejo, California. The air was warm and humid, filled with the smell of blooming flowers, and the only sound was the distant hum of cars driving by on the nearby highway. They were heading to a secluded spot to park and be alone. The night was alive with fireflies and the stars were beginning to twinkle in the sky. As they approached the spot, their lives would soon come to a tragic end. David Faraday had been dating Betty Lou for a few months, and tonight was supposed to be a special night for the young couple. They had met at a local church gathering a few months ago, and it seemed like they were meant to be. David had borrowed his parents' car for the evening, and he was determined to make the most of it. He had promised Betty Lou a romantic evening, and she was expecting a perfect night. Little did they know, their plans would be cut short in a matter of moments. As they pulled into the secluded lover's lane, a figure emerged from the shadows. The figure was later described as a man with a mustache, wearing a suit and a dark-colored hat. He approached the car and shot through the window, striking both David and Betty Lou. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and both teenagers let out a blood-curdling scream. The killer then proceeded to shoot Betty Lou in the back, striking her in the kidney. David was shot in the back of the head. He tried to escape, but it was too late. The most shocking single detail of this crime is that the killer took the time to write a message on the victim's car, signing it with a cryptic symbol that would become synonymous with the Zodiac Killer. The message read, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild animals in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all." The image of the symbol and the message would be forever etched in the minds of the investigators who would later work on the case. This was a crime like no other, and it would send shockwaves through the community. The Zodiac Killer had struck, and no one knew his true identity. He would continue to kill, taunting the police with cryptic messages and codes, leaving the world wondering who he was and why he did what he did. The first reports of the Zodiac Killer's crimes began flooding in on December 20, 1968, when a man named Paul Stine, a cab driver, was shot and killed in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. Police were immediately called to the scene and began canvassing the area, looking for any signs of the killer or his motive. However, it wouldn't be until a cryptic letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle a few days later that the true extent of the Zodiac Killer's crimes became clear. The letter claimed responsibility for Stine's murder and included a gruesome cipher that would become a hallmark of the killer's communication. It also sparked a frantic police investigation that would ultimately prove to be a wild goose chase. The key piece of evidence that changed everything was a letter sent to the San Francisco Chronicle on November 7, 1969, claiming responsibility for the murder of David Faraday and his fiancée Betty Lou Jensen. This letter included a cipher that the killer dubbed the Z340, a 340-letter code that would prove to be one of the most baffling puzzles in the case. The letter also included a gruesome illustration of a body and a map of the area where the Faradays were killed. Experts would later estimate that it would take a team of mathematicians and cryptographers hundreds of hours to crack the code, and many would question whether it was worth the effort. Despite the daunting task ahead, the police were desperate to crack the code and bring the Zodiac Killer to justice. Over the years, a number of individuals would emerge as suspects in the case, from Arthur Lee Allen to Richard Gaikowski. Arthur Lee Allen was a 39-year-old convicted child molester who fit the description of the Zodiac Killer provided by a witness. He was also known to have a fascination with the occult and a history of violence, which made him an intriguing candidate to investigators. However, despite repeated investigations and interviews, Allen was ultimately cleared as a suspect due to a lack of concrete evidence. Other suspects would follow, but none would ever be convicted of the Zodiac Killer's crimes. One of the biggest mistakes investigators made was their reliance on a suspect known as the Zodiac's favorite journalist, Paul Avery of the San Francisco Chronicle. Avery had been working closely with the police to help them understand the killer's cryptic messages and had even become a confidant of sorts to the Zodiac Killer. However, Avery's close connection to the case ultimately led him to be the focus of a massive investigation in 1972, which wasted months of valuable time and resources. The investigation into Avery would prove to be one of the longest and most expensive in the case, but ultimately, it turned up nothing. Despite the setback, investigators remained convinced that Avery was involved, but the truth would remain elusive. The revelation that nobody predicted, the moment that shook the Zodiac Killer case to its core, was the recent release of a DNA profile matching the killer to a man named Arthur Lee Allen. But this was no ordinary DNA match, it was extracted from a letter the killer had sent to the police back in the 1970s. This letter was previously believed to be a copycat, but the DNA evidence suggests that it was indeed written by the Zodiac Killer himself. Arthur Lee Allen passed away in 1992, but his family is still trying to come to terms with their loved one's dark secret. Despite this major breakthrough, Allen's family maintains that he was innocent and someone must have planted the evidence. Further investigation into Arthur Lee Allen's life suggests that he had a history of mental illness and was known to have been obsessed with the occult. The DNA evidence was found on a piece of paper that had been sealed in an envelope, and investigators believe that it was likely used as a makeshift envelope to send the letter to the police. This twist has brought new scrutiny to the case, and many are left wondering how a potential suspect was let off the hook so many years ago. The fact that Allen's family maintains his innocence raises questions about the reliability of the DNA evidence. As we delve deeper into the case, one thing is certain, the Zodiac Killer's true identity is finally starting to unravel. Despite the recent DNA breakthrough, the case remains unsolved to this day. Arthur Lee Allen's DNA does match the killer, but many experts have raised questions about the reliability of the evidence. The case has been reopened several times, but the lead investigators have come up empty-handed every time. The Zodiac Killer's modus operandi was to taunt the police and leave behind cryptic clues, and it's possible that he had an accomplice or two. The case remains one of the most infamous unsolved serial killer cases in American history. Arthur Lee Allen's family has been left reeling from the DNA revelation, and many are left wondering if they should have been more vigilant about his behavior. The lead investigators on the case have come and gone over the years, and some have even passed away. The Zodiac Killer's case has had a lasting impact on the field of forensic science, and it's credited with paving the way for modern DNA analysis. The case has also had a profound impact on the communities affected by the Zodiac's brutal crimes. The Zodiac's case will continue to captivate true crime enthusiasts for years to come. Should the police have investigated Arthur Lee Allen more thoroughly when they first received the DNA match, do you think this would have solved the case earlier? A or B, let us know in the comments below.